Hello, welcome back to another video. Today's the third and last episode of our Celeste series where I'm making a Celeste inspired cosplay or outfit, I guess. We've made the skirt, we've made the sweater vest, and today we're going to be tackling the blouse or shirt. It's really just an excuse for me to make myself a new white shirt. This is the fabric that I'm going to be using. It is from Minerva.com. I got it for free because I am a brand ambassador. This is like a broderie anglaise. I think in the America you call this like eyelet fabric. I'll obviously be leaving a link to this in the description so you can go and check it out. There's other colors too. Yeah, so I have about 1.4 meters of this, and for the pattern I'm gonna go with the Vogue 8772. I have made this, I think I've actually made this on the channel before. It's the same blouse that I used for my Hogwarts Legacy uniform, but I'm actually gonna change up the sleeves. I want to do like a poofier kind of different sleeve, and I also don't want to do these cuffs. It's not that they're complicated, but they're a bit more like dressier than what I want. I also need to figure out what I'm doing for buttons. Either I have something in my stash or I'll get some buttons. Oh, you know, it'd be really cute to use the little beads as buttons, the same beads that I used for the skirt. I'm gonna go think about that for a bit. So I'm gonna go get started with cutting out and all that good stuff. I laid out the fabric and got my pattern pieces out, and after sorting through which ones I actually needed for today, I started pinning them to my fabric. I honestly didn't even think about pattern matching until I'd actually started sewing, which is such a typical Olga thing to do. But anyway, nothing bad happened, so it's okay. I decided to use the sleeve from the pattern as a base, but I added 5 centimeters to each side seam to make it extra poofy, and I also used the same cuff pattern, but I stitched it differently to the instruction. And then I started cutting out my fabric. I also did some tailor stacks on the collar pieces because I still need to fuse the interfacing, and I also cut out my notches and then marked everything else with a heat erasable pen. Next, I cut out the interfacing for the collar pieces and for the cuffs, and I fused it using a hecking ton of steam. That is not the manufacturer's instructions, but I'm impatient with this kind of thing and it works fine, so whatever. I'm using Vilene Vliezylene H310 here, but I always leave a link in the description to the materials that I use if I can link them, so this will be linked below. Okay. Hello, it's a brand new day, and yes, I am wearing the vest today. So I have cut out all of my fabric for this blouse, and I have gone ahead and like marked everything, and I also went ahead and serged some of the edges yesterday. I did the like shoulder and side edges, or I forgot one of them, just to like avoid than having to constantly switch between machines. I really have not stopped thinking about using the same beads that I used for the skirt on the shirt and like make them the buttons. I need to think about how I would do that, but I really want to do it because I feel like it would be so cute. But I feel like they would work similar to like shank buttons, right? But let's get started with this actual sewing. I'm starting off by pinning my darts. There's 2 darts on each front piece and 4 darts on the back piece. I'm pinning them flat like I always do before pinching them in place and pinning them in the correct position to sew. I'm also pinning the front opening edges, which will be our button plackets, and that's just to press them when I press the darts. Before I stitch my darts, I'm actually going to quickly do the basting stitches on the cuffs and the tops of my sleeves. I'm using the longest stitch length my machine will do and sewing 2 lines of stitches in the seam allowance of the cuff and the sleeve caps. Then I'll stitch the darts, backstitching only at the wide part of the single tipped darts. After I've stitched them all, I press them in place and also press the front opening edges so I can remove those pins. When I'm pressing the darts, I also tie off the threads of the tips and cut them, leaving about 2 centimeter tail. Now I'm going to pin as many things as I can. First, I'm going to pin the front and back pieces with right sides together at the sides and shoulders. Then I'm going to pin the sleeves closed as well as the cuffs along the short edges. And lastly, I'm going to be pinning the collar closed, leaving the notched edge free. Next, I'll sew all of those seams over on the sewing machine, making sure to backstitch at the start and finish of every seam. After sewing, I'm going to trim the collar's seam allowances, making sure to clip my corners so that when I flip it inside out, I can have really sharp corners. I'm using a point turner to really get in there and then pressing the collar right side out. The cuffs also get their seam allowances trimmed and then get pressed using my clapper. While I'm here, I'm also going to press the seam allowance on one of the ends in, and I'm using my seam gauge to double check that I've got the right measurement. The opposite end will get sewn to the sleeve, and then I'll fold the cuff in half and stitch this folded edge on the inside by hand, but I'll show you that later. The seams of the sleeves also get pressed open, as well as the side and shoulder seams of the bodice. And while I've got the iron on, I'm also going to press up the seam allowance on the longer edge of the uninterfaced collar stand. For the next batch of pinning, I started with the collar. First, I pinned the collar to the collar stand by pinning the uninterfaced side of the collar to the interfaced piece of the collar band. Then I added the uninterfaced collar band piece on top and pinned it all together, sandwiching the collar in there. I also pinned the cuffs to the sleeves with right sides together. To do that, I matched up the seams of both cuffs and the sleeves, tied off the gathering stitches on one side, and pulled on the other until the sleeve and cuff matched up. I tied off the gathering threads I was just using, and then distributed the gathers around the cuff sort of evenly before I pinned that all in place, and then repeated for the other sleeve. I stitched those seams in, being especially careful with the cuffs. Next, it was time to trim the seam allowances on the collar, turn it right side out, and press it in place. I found the center of the collar stand and also pinned my tag there. Then I trimmed the seam allowance on the cuffs and pressed them down. Now I can actually fold up the cuff so that the folded edge covers the seam and press that in place before pinning it too. I stitched the tag in place really quickly and then stitched the inside of the cuffs by hand. After that, I could move on to pinning the collar to the shirt, leaving the pressed edge free. I like to fold back the opening edge over the collar so that it creates a little facing almost. Then I stitched that in place, taking it slow and making sure that I didn't get any tucks along the way. Once that's sewn, I trimmed the excess and clipped the corners of the opening edges. I turned the opening edges back to their correct position and make sure that I got the corners nice and sharp before pressing them and the collar seam allowances. I press the seam allowances up so that I can hide them, but that means I do have to clip them right next to the opening edges. Now I'm going to pin the folded edge of the collar stand over the seam and then, you guessed it, stitch it by hand. It's now the next day. I have gotten this far with the blouse. I have the sleeves left to stitch on there, the hem, and the buttons. So I've been testing out whether or not I could use the beads that I used on the skirt as buttons or not, like how I would do that. I made some buttonholes and I stitched one on and it works. Like, I can't believe it works. I'm so excited. I have to stitch it on so that there's like a bit of thread underneath to give it a little bit of height. So yeah, just plop it on through. There we go. So I did have to make the buttonhole smaller. Otherwise it will just like open on its own. But this way, like, you have to pull in a very specific angle for them to come out. And it works perfectly. I'm really satisfied with it. I think we're going ahead with the stars. I'm gonna go and do the rest of the shirt. It's finally time to set the sleeves in, and I started at the bottom of the armhole by matching up the seams of the sleeve and the bodice. Then I pinned up until the notches. And here I did the same method to get the fabric together as I did for the cuffs, but instead of distributing the gathers, I actually concentrated them all at the shoulder seam, and then I pinned that all in place. Now that I know that my little star button plan was going to work, I could not wait to get the blouse finished, so I actually started prepping the hem as well by folding back the front opening edges at the hem of the blouse and putting that in place, again to form a sort of self-facing. I took that over to the machine to stitch all of those things in place. At this point, I'm also going to just run the seams of the armholes through the serger to trim and finish them in one go. I trimmed the inside of the opening edges like so to reduce the bulk when I fold them back into place, just like I did at the top of the shirt. Then I pressed them, and this is now going to serve as a guide for the rest of the hem. While the iron was on, I also pressed my sleeve seam allowances in place. I like pressing them towards the sleeve. To mark the rest of the hem, I used my seam gauge to double check I was folding it up 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch, and I pressed that in. Then I folded the raw edge down so that it met the crease I just made with the iron and pinned that in place, and this is just the way that I do a narrow hem, by the way. And finally, I did stitch that down on the machine after entertaining the thought of doing it by hand, so I would have no visible stitching on this blouse. But yeah, I'm going to wear this tucked in probably 100% of the time, so it's not really worth the extra time and effort. Plus, I was really itching to get started on the buttons. To mark my buttonholes, I used the guide provided by the pattern for the placement, but then I did use my seam gauge to mark the size of the buttonhole that I had come up with in my sample. Then I set my machine's settings to sew the buttonholes. I used the buttonhole stitch length, set the width of my stitches to 5, and then I add the buttonhole foot that came with my machine, and I'm ready to work on those buttonholes. I cut off all of those threads before opening up my buttonholes with the seam ripper that I got in the Prym advent calendar, and I really like this one. It's probably my favorite seam ripper I've ever had. To mark my button placement, I used the buttonholes I just made as a guide. Then it's finally time to stitch my little stars in place. I'm using the thread doubled up to make it quicker and sturdier, and tying a knot at the end, then trying to always poke my needle through the same spot. Once I've got the star placed in the correct location, I do about 4 more passes of thread to make sure that it's really secure. When I've done that, I wrap my thread around the thread at the base of the star to create the height that I mentioned earlier. After wrapping it a few times, I do 2 last wraparounds where I tie the thread in a knot by looping the needle through. I move the needle back to the inside of the button placket to tie it off, and once I've stitched all the stars in, we're ready for the reveal.